Welcome to everyone to the Sector Jobs Resilience Plan learning event. This is the third learning event that we have hosted on this broad theme of work, and we still will have one more. In our first session last year, we looked at the National Employment Vulnerability Assessments, which covered 5 key sectors, and we unpacked where the vulnerabilities sit and some of the challenges that each of those sectors faced. Then earlier this year, we had a seminar looking at the sector jobs resilience plans and how we can try and overcome some of those vulnerabilities and respond to some of those challenges. This session, we're unpacking each of those and this one and the next one. We're unpacking some of these sector job issues, and what we have internally called deep dives, where we're starting to explore some of the very detailed and specific issues that try and enhance our understanding of the challenges in the sector and where some of the opportunities sit. So today we've got 5 presentations. We're going to be looking at petroleum-based transport, which was the SGRP, and this is an analysis of taxi industry transition, and that will be presented by Nokwanda Maseko. We then have another one looking specific, also in that same theme, looking at automotive mechanics and the shift to low carbon transition, particularly around employment vulnerability and active labour market policy responses. And that will be presented by Kirsten, and it's a number of people who worked on that paper. And then still in the first session, we'll have a discussion on the social labour plans in South Africa's coal and metals value chain, and that will be presented by Mohammed Patel. We'll then break for a bit of discussion on those 3 inputs, and then we'll have a second discussion where we'll be looking at the measures to decarbonize the mining value chain, and that will be presented by Akona Miyataza and Sakile Ndlovu. And then we'll also have a paper looking at the platinum group metals in transition, and that will be presented by Lesego Moshikaro. And then we'll open up for more broader discussion on both that session and the earlier session, and we'll take inputs and questions from everyone online and in the room. In doing these deep dives, we're looking at more granular information on the impact of this transition away from fossil fuels, as well as the weather-related issues. And just in going through this process, we continue to enhance our knowledge and understanding of the key issues that are confronting us. And, as we've said earlier, the timelines are not, tomorrow, but we know these things are happening, and the imperative is that by building up a knowledge base on each of these sectors and going into more granular detail in the research, we're able to put in the strategies to overcome some of these challenges over time. So I'm looking forward to the set of presentations. There's a lot of learning that can be done, and that's why we've specifically called it a learning event, and it's an opportunity to engage with some rich content. Let me then hand over to our first speaker, and that's going to be Nokwanda Maseko, who's an economist at TIPS on the taxi industry transition. Thank you.
Thanks, Saul. So I haven't been up here in a bit, so I'm seeing it's fancy up here. Congratulations. Morning, colleagues. As introduced, my name is Nokwanda Maseko. I am a senior economist here at TIPS, and I will be taking you through the taxi industry transition study. Right. Quick outline. So I'm just going to give an overview, like brief context of the industry, look at the challenges to the transition, and then get into some enabling factors, including access to NEV technologies as well as financing options. Right. So, by way of context, I think we know that the taxi industry is largely informal, which then sort of poses a challenge in terms of its ability to transition. It is an industry that has just over 300,000 licensed and unlicensed vehicles, as well as more than 300,000 people that are employed. And although it accounts for less than 5% of passenger transport of the live vehicle population of passenger transport. And you will see in the notes that this includes passenger vehicles and station wagons, it includes minibuses, it includes bus trains. And that data is based off of NETIS registrations. But in any case, we are not necessarily sure of the total emissions coming from the taxi industry, but we do know that it is obviously contributing to road transport emissions. And so reducing road transport emissions also requires reducing taxi industry emissions, which is why there is a need to transition to NEVs. All right, so some of the key challenges that the industry faces in terms of its transition, there's a few of them. So the first one is availability of NEV minibus taxi models. So there are a few that are made in different countries. So there's the Hyundai County Electric. That is not a widely available model. There's also the Chinese-made Okwell electric vehicle that carries up to 11 people. And so the actual seat capacity is important because the minibus taxi itself, the definition is in the actual South African regulations on road transport. And so that would be a vehicle that carries up to 16 people. The local model is still at pilot phase, and that would be the Ikamva. And so that is not widely available. Yeah. And then the other challenge is the high upfront cost of just generally NEV models. So if you look at the entry level for the Ikamva, it's estimated between 1.1 million and 1.2 million. You compare that with around 400,000 to 800,000 for an ICE minibus taxi. So you start to see then the differentials there. There's also the limited availability of charging infrastructure. There's just over 500 charging stations in the country. Most of them are in urban areas as well as along long distance routes. And that then poses a challenge in terms of can taxis actually access this, especially taxis that are not in urban areas. And the last one of the ones that I include would be the issue of energy. So obviously here, if we're looking at emissions reduction, it does not make sense to then transfer the emissions from, combustion from ICE vehicles to charging infrastructure. And so in this case, for this to work, we would need charging infrastructure that's powered through solar energy. And so also in the last few years, we have obviously had a challenge as it relates to load shedding, although it has gotten better in the last 2-ish years. And so in terms of just enabling the transition for the industry, in terms of allowing for or enabling access, there are a few opportunities or a few routes that can be taken. So the first one is around local manufacturing. There is capacity to manufacture just over 15,000 taxis in the country at present, and those are ICE vehicles. Made by Toyota as well as BAW. And then these are incentivized through the Passenger Carrier Automotive Investment Scheme, which essentially then funds up to 35% of qualifying investments. It also applies to the manufacture of components as well. And so in this case, there is the possibility that those assemblers could change their production lines to cater for the manufacture or assembly of NEVs, either through a single line that runs just NEVs, or it would be like a mixed method in sort of the medium to long term, where you mix production of ICE vehicles and NEVs, with obviously the goal to fully transition. The second option is conversion of the existing ICE fleet to NEVs, and that would essentially mean that, you know, the taxis that already exist, you take those, you convert them such that they are able to they use essentially a battery. And this is similar to the model that would have been used for the dual fuel conversion that was proposed a few years ago, which was to use diesel and natural gas. Obviously here, the battery is more expensive than the actual conversion to natural gas, but there are some costs to consider, but that is one option. And then the other option is importing the necessary models as they become widely available globally. The other big issue is the actual upfront cost of NEVs, even though there is obviously the sense that long-term operating an NEV is far cheaper than an ICE vehicle. The issue is that the upfront costs remain largely prohibitive, and so would need to then deal with how do we address the issue of upfront costs so that the taxi industry can actually start to acquire those vehicles. And one of the options here is using the taxi recapitalization program, which was established in 2006. And that was to essentially scrap old taxi vehicles from public roads, and operators were then given an allowance of 50,000 Rand. That has since changed to around 165,000 as of 2026. But for the taxi recapitalization program to work, there would need to be a few changes, including in the definition of old taxi vehicles. So at present, it covers taxis that were made, acquired, or purchased prior to 4 September 2006. And so we'd need to then change the definition of that so that newer model taxis can then be allowed as part of the sort of scrapping process. The other one would be the sort of installation of an obligation to purchase. So the current recapitalization program does not require operators to use the scrapping allowance to pay that as deposit for acquiring a new taxi. So in this case, there is the possibility that that would then become an obligation to say you can only use this money to pay a deposit for purchase of an NEV, also to sort of discourage people by taking the allowance and then buying an ICE vehicle. And then the other one would be the increase in the actual scrapping allowance. So if you look at the actual calculations based off of available pricing information, 165,000 covers around 30% of a petrol taxi. That would be the quantum. It covers around 15% of the 1.2 million of the ECAMVA. And so there would be a need to sort of increase that amount to be able to sort of support the industry's transition. And then the other two options, one would be private financing. Again, the taxi industry is largely informal, which means access to formal financing is quite difficult. And so most of the industry's acquisition of vehicles is done through organizations such as SA Taxi, which also sells pre-owned vehicles. It also does financing and insurance as well as maintenance. They have worked in partnership with the African Development Bank, acquiring a loan of just over $90 million. I believe it was around $100 million to help with things such as formalization of the industry. And so that's really where most of the financing comes from. There is a recent partnership between ABSA and Photon that allows for SMEs to buy vehicles using Photon taxi financing money that's backed by ABSA. And then the sort of last option is not so much about giving money to the industry as much as it's making the actual cars cheaper by taking out the battery and then supplying that in two different options. So the first one would be a rent to buy option that would work in a similar model as solar packages, where you pay for the battery over a number of years through specialized financing. And then once the cost of that is fully paid off, then the battery ownership moves to the taxi operator. The other option is just a straight lease option with no option to buy at the end. So you rent the battery, use it, and then once it's flat, you swap it out for a fully charged one. You pay for that new battery that's fully charged. And that would essentially take out the requirement of each new NEV coming in with the battery, and therefore removing some 40%-ish of the cost that comes with the NEVs. That's essentially my presentation. But yeah, I think I have made the key points that, the industry is largely informal, and so it does require support. How we think about that support really should be around issues of actually getting access to the taxi models, as well as working through some of the financing issues, so that the industry does have access to these vehicles. I do think that at 10 million people, that's a big chunk of the South African population that it moves around, and so it cannot be ignored. Thank you.
Thank you, Nokwanda. We're going to take questions and comments at the end, so if you can note them and also in the chat, then we can have discussion in a few minutes on the first three presentations. Just to remind everyone that all the PowerPoints, as well as the more detailed paper, will be available on the TIPS website, as well as the video from today's event will be available on the TIPS website, hopefully by the end of the week, or latest early next week after Easter. We're now going to have our next presentation. So this is going to be Dylan's presentation supporting automotive mechanics in South Africa, in South Africa's low carbon transition. This paper he has produced with Lesego Moshikaro and Siutame Maamela. Dylan, over to you.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you, Saul, for that introduction. As Saul said, I'm Dylan Kirsten, economist at TIPS, and today we'll be presenting on supporting automotive mechanics in South Africa's low carbon transition. And this report was also done by my two colleagues, Lesego and Siutame. Just an outline of the presentation, we'll be looking at employment profile of South Africa's automotive mechanics, the impact of the transition on them, and available options for the auto mechanics to adapt to this transition. And lastly, the recommendations. So in 2025, in quarter two, South Africa had approximately 220,000 auto mechanics with a median age of 40 years old. Employment was evenly split between formal and informal workers, with informal employment almost doubling between 2010 and quarter two of 2025. Many mechanics displaced during the pandemic did not return to formal employment. And in the second quarter of 2025, we saw that black mechanics accounted for 73% of all auto mechanics. Most mechanics operate as self-employed or own account workers without hiring employees. Informal small businesses dominate the sector, with about 50,000 informal SMEs compared to 20,000 formal SMEs between 2010 and 2024. Growth in small business activity closely follows the rise in informal automotive mechanics. And we see that small businesses owned by auto mechanics are concentrated in Gauteng, KZN, Western Cape, and the Eastern Cape. In 2021, formal mechanics earned a median wage of 7,500 compared to 2,200 for informal mechanics. In the second quarter of 2025, 46% of auto mechanics had no matric, 38% had completed matric, 3% had a post-matric certificate, and 10% possessed a training certificate. The proportion holding a bachelor's degree, specifically a Bachelor of Arts degree, has declined. Most auto mechanics do not contribute to UIF, but approximately 80% of formal auto mechanics make UIF contributions. And most informal auto mechanics do not contribute to medical aid as well, with approximately 27% of formal auto mechanics contributing. We see that informal auto mechanics generally do not belong to trade unions, whereas 31% of formal auto mechanics are unionized. So looking at the impacts of the transition on auto mechanics, the NEV transition will restructure jobs rather than eliminating them. There is steady NEV growth, mainly driven by hybrids, and the demand for engine and exhaust repairs will decline, while tire and suspension and bodywork services may still increase. Reduced maintenance needs will lower routine service work overall, though. Skill demand is shifting towards electronics, diagnostics, and high voltage systems. Informal mechanics are most vulnerable due to the limited access to reskilling. And we see that the job of a mechanic is moving from mechanical to more technologically driven tasks. The available options for auto mechanics to adapt, we're just looking at the 4 options that are highlighted in the report, are upskilling and reskilling, the recognition of prior learning program, income support, and training the next generation. To touch on a few, we say that upskilling and reskilling is essential as NEV adoption grows, and higher education levels boost availability to learn NEV skills. And informal mechanics can expand services and increase their income. The recognition of prior learning program formally recognizes existing skills and experience, and this supports the transition to NEV roles. However, high trade test costs and limited funding are barriers to it. Income support protects workers from transition-related income loss, and this was effective during the COVID-19 disruptions. Options include the social release of the stress grants and expanded UIF. And informal businesses also need financial aid to adapt. In training the next generation, high youth unemployment offers a chance to train future mechanics. Training in NEV technologies meets future industry demand, and with a workforce that is aging, retirements are also approaching with the median age of 40 years old. And hybrids allow for gradual reskilling of this process. And looking at the recommendations going forward, a streamlined and collaborative approach is needed to align stakeholders. Stakeholders should work together to jointly prepare, train, and retrain auto mechanics for emerging NEV technologies. And this coordination would improve responsiveness to skills and ensure more targeted and inclusive interventions. Key stakeholders include the Departments of Higher Education, MESITA, RMI, the DICC, and the likes. The recognition for prior learning for informal mechanics, many informal townships and rural mechanics rely on ICE-based skills. They remain the most accessible and affordable service providers and will still be needed. It is essential to extend training that builds on their existing experience while equipping them with NEV-related technical skills. And strengthening the RPL will help formally recognize their skills. Informal mechanics face safety risks when working with high-voltage EV systems, making training and support critical. On the other recommendations, see that scale training for qualified auto mechanics, as advanced training must be scaled. Current training is insufficient to meet growing demand, and access to training should be broadened across the sector to both formal and informal mechanics. Introducing a UIF mechanism for informal workers, as few informal auto mechanics contribute to UIF limiting their access to income support. A mechanism should be introduced to extend income support to formal workers, and short-term support measures could help vulnerable workers. Lastly, improving access to finance for informal small business owners. Small businesses face limited access to finance from institutions. This limits their ability to invest in tools, training, and business adaptation. Lastly, improved access to finance is essential for their survival and competitiveness. Thank you.
Thanks, Dylan. I think that gives us some useful insights into some of the challenges that we're going to be seeing in the automotive sector, both in the taxi space and in the area of mechanics. And the papers will go into a bit more detail, but start to give us an understanding of some of the possible interventions to help manage this transition so that it's smoother and doesn't create a dislocation and job losses that we have risks in facing, and also contributes in the discussion with Nokwanda to reducing emissions. We're now going to move to the next presentation by Mohammed Patel, who's a senior economist at TIPS, who's going to look at the social labor plans in South Africa's coal and metal value chains.
Okay, thank you. Thank you so much, colleagues, for joining us today. So today I'm going to be discussing one of the deep dives that focuses on SLPs, social and labor plans, and trying to assess the role of this institutional and legal tool in a just transition, with a specific focus on two value chains that were studied as part of the project. It's the coal value chain and metals value chain. Okay, so a key message. So I mean, I have 12 minutes, so I can't give you everything, but I'll try not to give you nothing, right? So a key message is that SLPs hold an important role in the just transition, but it's important to understand their scope. They are a tool that applies to the mining stage of value chains, so largely focused around there. Their benefits can extend, particularly given the regional intensity of mining that we see in certain value chains. So they are a partial support mechanism, but not a standalone just transition instrument. Importantly, they hold a lot of value as an early warning system. We often see that in different value chains, the direct impacts may manifest at different stages, not directly at mining, but the existence of the SLP tool can help shield workers at the mining value stage, even though they have no ability to influence the decisions that impact the demand for their respective products or minerals. So we took the structure in the paper, and this is kind of the structure I'm following here in the presentation of, firstly setting out the legal and institutional baseline for SLP. So where do they originate? How do they align with just transition policy tools and packages? And then also reflecting a bit on gaps to date and where they can be enhanced a bit further as we think about transitioning towards lower carbon value chains in the country. So quickly, just on the legal and institutional baseline, for a mining right to be granted, the mining firm or the entity has to submit an SLP that gets approved by what's now DMPR, and only on the basis of that submitted SLP can the mining right be granted. Now, the MPRDA, which sort of sets the basis for SLPs, and the subsequent amendments to the MPRDA kind of outline, the contents that need to be included in such a plan. And the updated amendments also reflect a bit of emphasis around consultation, the extent of consultation, and importantly, the linkages of SLPs to municipal LED and IDP plans. So just very quickly, some of the key information that mining rights holders need to supply in terms of the SLPs are, basic information about the commodity, the life of mine, where workers originate from, whether they come from the immediate locality, whether they come from other areas in the country, or whether they come from abroad. They also should include human resource information like learnerships, plans for bursaries, career progression, as well as targets that need to be met in terms of when the updated SLPs are provided, and usually that's a frequency of every 5 years. There's also aspects that relate to local economic development and post-mine usage. So companies have to provide plans about how mines will be rehabilitated or used post-mining, as well as provisions for downscaling and retrenchment. So when impacts manifest, how job losses are going to be managed and handled, and setting up institutional structures like future forums, for example, where this sort of early warning system can apply. Importantly, also, mining rights holders need to provide the financial resources to ensure that these plans are rolled out, and are also responsible for monitoring and implementing. So the picture looks really good in design, but we know when the rubber hits the road, there's often issues around SOPs and the extent to which they provide benefits to workers, to surrounding communities, etc. But importantly, what we try to do in the paper, and given that the overall goal of the analysis is looking at the just transition, is to try and link some of the elements in SOPs to the policy tools that we have in our just transition basket. So here, quickly, elements from the human resource component link directly to the role of active labor market policies in terms of reskilling, retraining, and redeploying labor. When it comes to planning for downscaling and retrenchment, this can serve as an early warning system, particularly in certain value chains, like the coal value chain, for example, where domestic demand for coal is largely determined by the downstream players like Eskom and Saul, and are contingent on their decarbonization decisions and pathways, and the feedstocks that they decide to adopt. But the SLPs in this case can act as an early warning system to mitigate impacts to workers at the mining stage. Also, there's elements of economic diversification which relate to the LED and IDP components, as well as implementation capacity around the consultation and the need for continuously monitoring and planning for adverse events, particularly labor shocks. So in the piece, we look at two value chains that are studied in a bit more detail in the vulnerability assessment and the SJRP, just to provide some indication of the utility of SLPs in some of these value chains. In coal, SLPs have a strong role to play. We know from the NEVA analysis, there's about 100,000 direct coal mining workers in the value chain, large geographic concentration in Mpumalanga in a few key municipalities. And there are some provisional risk windows that appear based on domestic energy planning and global demand for coal. Now, we obviously know that energy markets are in a state of flux, and it's become an environment where it's really difficult to determine the demand for fossil fuels, the demand for coal, etc. But these are the provisional risk windows that we see at the time. Initially declining demand for coal based on IRP commitments, and then further declining demand from international partners and further decommissions as they happen in the IRP. So the impact is a bit more immediate in terms of coal when we contrast it to metals. And here SLPs can begin to prepare the workforce and add robustness to employment risk, especially given the uncertainty of the impacts and when they'll manifest. When it comes to metals, the story is a bit different. We know that in metals, the key issues sit at the smelting beneficiation stage, largely center around energy usage and technological choices. At the mining stage, the impacts are are not as predictable and a bit more longer term based on the assessment. However, SLPs here still have a role to play, particularly where mining activities are highly concentrated and account for a large share of gross value added employment in some of these local municipalities. And we list some of them there at the bottom. But that's not necessarily a bad thing. It essentially means that SLPs can here again, provide a buffer and support and an early warning system so that the labor force is prepared should risks, employment risks specifically manifest in a potentially longer term, in a longer time period. So when it comes to SOPs, and here just to give a sense of how we see a division between the different elements of social and labor plans, specifically looking at the coal value chain and taking from recent research by Cole and colleagues, where they assessed about 33 coal mines in South Africa, we see a high proportion of support going to human resource development, so reskilling, retraining, bursaries, etc. And there's actual targets set for these. We also see a significant proportion going for downscaling and retrenchment, so allocations being made for downscaling and retrenchment and post-mining activities. We see smaller shares for LED and particularly for housing and enterprise and supply development. So this just gives us a sense of how the pie is cut when we think about SLPs and how SLPs are actually functioning. But an important part of the story is that typically SLPs will report, results. So many bursaries have been granted, or so many learnerships have been granted, but there isn't really a particular tracking of what happens with that given employee. Does it manifest in new employment, or have we ticked the box if we've sent X, Y, or Z person for a training course? So in terms of the overall assessment, there are a number of weaknesses when we look at the SLPs and how they're implemented in South Africa. So while there's often a lot of proactive elements in the SLP design, some of the issues that come up are indicated in these blocks. Some of the main ones relate to transparency and traceability. So, is there complete transparency around how the funds are used, how employees benefit, and tracking those employees into new employment? There's often critique about the extent of alignment of SLPs with local economic planning and the extent to which SLP projects benefit local communities. There's also issues around consultation, which is why the 2020 amendments actually make a bit more harder provisions around the frequency of engaging with communities and how often that needs to happen throughout the process. So in the paper, and based on the overall analysis as well of the different value chains, we say there are some priorities that emerge that can assist us in bolstering how SLPs work. So firstly, the formation of a large and consolidated register of employees for given mining value chains is important. And here it's also important to track casual or informal or contract labor, which some mines publish information on, some mines don't publish information on. But this also gives us an indication of informal labor that may be affected as a result of impacts to the value chain. How this happens and through which institutional structures it happens can be devised or determined, but at least in theory, it's important at a conceptual level to have a database or register that can allow for planning and allow for an understanding of the system. I'm coming to the end of my time, so I'm going to conclude. Another component relates to connecting SLPs to the wider transition system, acknowledging their role as occurring at the mining stage of the value chain, but also acknowledging their role as an early warning system and a potential buffer. So finally, SLPs are best understood as a partial but a very important instrument, particularly in mining value chains. In the course of the research, we identified areas for future research. I won't go through all of them, but one relates to the point that I made about tracking workers. To make sure that our policies and our plans are working, we need to ensure that those that we reskill and retrain are actually finding meaningful employment afterwards. And reskilling and retraining is not treated like a tick box exercise. There are a number of other issues and themes which we cover in the report. I didn't get a chance to get to them today, but we will share the report with everyone so that you can have a look. And if there's ever questions, please feel free to reach out. Thank you.
Thank you, Mohammed. One of the things that strikes me between the earlier presentations on autos and petroleum-based transport and the mining sector is the difference in informality, where we see in the transport sector, there's a high degree of informality around taxi drivers and mechanics, whereas in the coal and the metals industries, we highly regulated. And that regulation comes with very specific provisions around community engagement, worker support, and can be used as a lever to support the transition away from fossil fuels. I'm now going to open up to questions and comments. If there are questions in the room, please raise your hand and someone will bring you a mic. And if you can introduce yourself, we'll start with Victor. If you can introduce yourself and ask your question.
Hi, good morning. Thanks. Hi, I'm Richard Worthington.
So Richard.
Not Victor Morning. But often seen with him. Around the taxi industry, I'm wondering if there's any sense of the scale of subsidies that are currently enjoyed by the taxi industry as embodied in internal combustion engines, given that the country does have commitments to reforming fossil fuel subsidies. So it would be an interesting lens to take to see the big picture. And then just regarding the social and labour plans, I know that Eskom isn't part of your scope on that, but around coal-fired power, around the coal-fired power stations, isn't there something analogous to SLPs? And given that the coal sector job resilience plan was the first one completed, I'm just wondering if you have been drawing on that at all, and if you have any insight on the status of jobs resilience plans for the sectors that you have been dealing with. I didn't pick up on where those are in terms of whether they're anything other than a statement of intent at this stage. Thanks.
Thanks.
Oh, and I am a volunteer with Project 90 by 2030, an NGO based in Cape Town.
Thanks, Richard. Sorry about that. Any other questions in the room? Okay, if there are any comments or questions online, we do have quite a few. Let me just check them and I'll read them out for... okay, so a comment from Marius who raises concerns about a battery replacement cost more than the purchase price of the vehicle. This cannot be ignored. Batteries will have to be replaced one day. A question from Ronald. What is the view on using biofuels, biodiesel or renewable diesel or biomethane as low carbon transition fuels? Question from Aisha, who's coming from the Circular Electronics Initiative, to Nokwanda. What is the view of taxi associations? Have they been involved? Let me pause there. I've got three more here. Let me ask all of them and then you can work it out. You'll remember them. And then, so a question also to Nokwanda from Motlantlo. To what extent do public transport stakeholders, so owners, drivers and mechanics, understand the transition to cleaner and low carbon transport systems and its socio-economic impacts, and what has been the overall response of the sector to this transition? Okay, then a question from Tanya to Dylan. Can you provide more detail on a mechanism that could be used to introduce, that could be introduced in UIF to assist mechanics in the informal sector? You got that? Okay. And then a question from Aisha to Mohammed. How does the SLP work with mergers and acquisitions? Are there contingency continuity requirements? Okay. Lots of questions. Can we start with, we'll go in order of speaker. Nokwanda, I don't know if you want to come back up here, and then we'll go through to Dylan and Mohammed.
Thanks, Saul. So I'm going to start on the subsidies. The taxi industry does not get any subsidies. The only really large subsidy they would have gotten was the COVID support. That was a once-off payment that was provided to the industry in 2020. But other than that, there is no direct support, unlike with buses and stuff like that. And I would sort of assume that part of that is due to the nature of the industry's informality. Yes, they have to comply with certain municipal bylaws and stuff like that, but they are informal and they don't receive any public support.
So the PAIS was a form of subsidy for taxi owners.
No. It's a PAIS is for manufacturers or assemblers. So yes, it's part of the incentive that DTIC gives out to the automotive industry. But this particular one is for those manufacturing passenger vehicles in large scales, not just the motor vehicles. And then on biofuels, I mean, that is always an option, but I think the question there is, does it make sense in the sense that we are obviously moving towards electric vehicles, maybe not in the next 10 years, but possibly in the next 15, 20 years. And remember, this requires putting in new infrastructure. The only biofuel refinery I am aware of right now is run by the NRCS. And so we would need to build capacity around that. Does that investment make sense in the sense that, you know, in the next few years, we are going to be transitioning fully to EVs? I know you're saying it in the context of a transition, as a transition fuel, but I think there are also those investment considerations. And then also, I think, you know, aside from the investment, it does also still lead to tailpipe emissions. So once again, you combine those two things, I think it becomes a challenge to make a case for that as something that could be put in place for the entire taxi industry that would then need certain people who would want to invest in those facilities. In terms of the role of the taxi associations, I mean, I would hope that they would be involved, but while I was doing the work, I did obviously try to figure out if there's anything that they've put out there to say this is their view on the transition. I'm sure they are in some ways in support of the transition, but there's no official documentation that I was able to find in terms of their support of their different members and how they would support them with the transition itself. I didn't do a survey to gauge the understanding of the industry in terms of the transition, but there is a paper I believe was put out by Green Cape where they spoke to some operators in the Western Cape, and the sense was that the industry is receptive to NEVs. They are obviously aware of them. They are receptive to the transition. Part of the problem that they raised, and I think it also comes up as a key issue in this presentation and in the reports that we've put out, is the issue of charging infrastructure. Aside from the upfront cost, the charging infrastructure is a key problem. Those are not as easily available, obviously. And so when you are a taxi operator, you have to also think about those things. If I'm not going to be able to charge my car, is it really worth it to transition if I can just keep my fossil fuel car and have access to a petrol station every few kilometers or so? Saul, I think that's all my questions.
Thanks. So Tanya's question on the mechanism to introduce like an extended UIF that is recommended in the report. This is a tough one and will have to be explored in detail fully and further later on, in the sense that, why is it a tough one? Because as explained and presented, that most informal mechanics don't contribute to UIF, with 20% in overall only contributing, and on the formal side, 80%. That leaves 90,000 employees only contributing to UIF. That's why we recommend that an extended UIF mechanism does be introduced soon to help, especially the informal sector. But in the short answer, I'm not too sure on the details going forward right now. We'd have to do further research. And we do also recommend that an extended UIF mechanism is introduced with an extended, as I explained, another grant with another grant like the SRD grant, and also incorporating a study levy. Thanks.
Great, thanks. So maybe first to deal with Richard's question. Okay, so first around Eskom power side. So I mean, I think it's becoming something of a cliche now, the experience of Eskom Komati, and a lot has been written about it. But one of the criticisms that have come through are that the Just Transition initiatives seem to stop at the gate of the plant, which means, and the critique is that, so the initiatives tend to be inside. So what happens to communities and other impacted stakeholders surrounding those? And it is a key gap that has been identified in the approach that Eskom has taken. That being said, there are other initiatives. For example, the Justice A group is looking at, Justice A unit is looking at, diversification activities and employment creation around Komati and taking a more wider regional view. But you certainly point to a gap in policy thinking and planning, in the sense that we can't see facilities as just standalone and totally devoid of their surroundings. And there certainly is an importance in policy planning when we think about that. Second, we have done sessions on the SJRPs and the NIVAs as well. So yeah, apologies. This was just a deep dive on the SOP, and I certainly am happy to share those resources with you as well. But just in terms of the elements that we looked at around the policy packages, they were related to governance and institutional arrangements. So who does the planning and how, who holds sort of the, so what I'm looking for, who holds the baton of leadership when it comes to implementing just transition policy. We also look at the role of the different tools: economic diversification, active labor market policies, climate mitigation measures, and the role of social and income support. So happy to share that work, and we can certainly discuss further. I think it was Aisha that asked, what happens, how does the SOPs work when there's mergers and acquisitions? And I think it's an important concern that Aisha raises, one that comes up often. You have the buying and selling of mining rights, which can occur, and SOPs are tied to the mining right. So so as long as the minister consents, Party A can sell the mining right to Party B, but in that process, there needs to be a proper assessment of whether Party B, the acquirer, can fulfill the SOP obligations. Right? There's meant to be. Right? Often in the past, we've seen large mining conglomerates will sell a mining right to a much smaller miner, who may commit to the SOP obligations that the conglomerate has committed to, but in practice, they are unable to meet them. And this is a big problem, and it's a big challenge that we see when it comes to the movement of mining rights between different firms. Yeah, so I think that about covers it. Yeah. Thank you.
Thanks. Are there any more questions in the room? I've got one more online, which is for Nokwanda, which we can quickly take, although I'm not sure if you've looked at this, is are you able to share the results of the micro-mobility trials in Alexandra and any other taxi pilots like Ekamva and the running costs? You don't have that data. Okay. So unfortunately, we unable to assist with that response. Okay. I mean, one of the things that struck me in one of the questions around the biofuels is that there's trade-offs in everything. Biofuels impact on food security, EVs impact on there's mining damage, there's also carbon emissions in the production of EVs, and there's obviously fossil fuel emissions in the ICE vehicles. So whichever path we're going down, there's going to be no path is perfect, but we are on a pathway to reducing emissions because of the damage and harm to the environment and the resulting climate crisis that we see emerging. So it is an area that's fraught, but I think we are looking at these pathways, and the biofuel discussion is an important one because a lot of, particularly the mining plans that have emerged are to look at industrial crops rather than food crops, because of when you're decommissioning the mine, it's often easier to plant industrial crops as a next step once on the mining land because of the toxins in the land. So there are many issues that need to be considered in all of these debates that are definitely part of future discussions that we should be having. Let me then move to the next set of presenters, and there will be an opportunity for people who've just posted questions for us to take questions to the earlier set of presenters as well as to the next set of presenters after their inputs. So we're going to ask Akona, Sakile, and Lesego to come up to the chairs in the hot seat. And then, so let's thank our first set of presenters. And we're now going to hand over to Akona and Sakile, who are going to do a double act. And they're going to be talking about identifying and evaluating measures to decarbonize the mining value chain. And they are both economists at TIPS. And over to you, Akona, who's going first.
Good morning, everyone. Summer. As introduced, my name is Akona Maseko. I'll be presenting with Sakile and Ndlovu findings on identifying and evaluating. Am I audible? Okay. I'll be presenting findings on identifying and evaluating measures for decarbonizing the mining value chain in South Africa. Next slide, please, Summer. So the research first maps the energy use and emissions across 6 mineral value chains, distinguishing between scope 1 to scope 3 emissions. And then we evaluate the clean technologies that are available for maturity and feasibility in a South African context. And then we look at how conducive is the policy environment in South Africa for mining companies to take decisions on whether which technologies they must introduce or deploy for decarbonization. And then we lastly looked at how decarbonization affects different stakeholders across different stakeholders using a socio-economic impact assessment. Next slide, please, Amma. Before we look at the decarbonization measures, it is important for us to set the context in terms of the contribution of mining in South Africa. If you look at the graph on the right, you can see that mining contributes significantly to South Africa's economic prosperity, shown by the 5% contribution to GDP. We see that mining employs a bulk number of people, evidenced by the more than 469 people that are employed within mining. Which means that mining anchors a lot of local and mining dependent regions. We know that South Africa is shaped by a mineral energy complex, which means that mining becomes a hard to abate sector, and decarbonization is not a straightforward mechanism. And then South Africa faces a dual challenge, where we must balance climate change commitments and also socio-economic impact, distribution impacts, which means that the solutions that mining companies introduce must not only be technically feasible, but they must also be economically and socially sustainable. Next slide, please, Amar. To center the analysis, we categorize emissions by scope. Scope 1 emission is indirect emissions that are owned by the company. They emanate from fuel combustion, furnaces and vehicles. And then we have scope 2 emissions. These are emissions that emanate mostly from electricity, from heating or steam. And then we have other indirect emissions, which is scope 3 emissions that are outside the company's control. These emanate from transport, land use, the use of sold products. Next slide, please. Now that we have set the scene in terms of the different types of scopes, and it is now important for us to delve deeper into the different mineral value chains, as emission profiles vary significantly across all the commodities. If you're looking at coal emissions emanate from fugitive methane that comes from underground and surface level operations, diesel use and combustion. And when you look at the international discourse where coal is concerned, we see that there's declining demand. However, coal decarbonization is a very sensitive issue in that there are many regions that it is embedded in the core activities, which means that the decarbonization in this particular value chain must also be sensitive to employment and regional economic dependence. When you look at the iron and steel value chain, we see that this value chain is deeply affected by electricity tariffs. We see that this value chain is deeply affected by electricity tariffs. It is also exposed to trade and regulatory dynamics such as the EU CBAM, which means that decarbonizing this value chain is not an environmental imperative, but it is also a direct competitive issue for the iron and steel value chain. When you look at the gold value chain, we see that this value chain emits through electricity that it uses for deep level mining, such as cooling and hosting. And then, although this value chain is indirectly exposed to high grid emission factors, it does emit through electricity use. And then as mines go deeper, the energy intensity increases, and this value chain is also susceptible to financial risk due to some mine closures. Next slide, please. So when you look at non-ferrous metals, we see that this value chain is also, like other value chains, extremely sensitive to electricity, which means that any diverging or any changes in carbon intensity and grid factors, they significantly determine its production viability. We also see that this value chain is highly dependent on a coal-based grid, which is particularly important given South Africa's mineral energy complex. When we look at the platinum group metals value chain, we see that this value chain is electricity intensive on deep level mining and smelting with diesel related scope 1 emissions. And then it is also exposed to shift in the global automotive industry. And then when we look lastly at the ferroalloys value chain, we see that this value chain is also highly sensitive to CBAM and electricity tariffs that have led to some smelter closures for most mining companies in South Africa. Now that I've set the scene for this presentation, my colleague Sakile will be taking you guys through the particular decarbonization measures that companies are introducing.
Thank you, Akona. My name is Sakile Ndlovu. I work at TIPS as a researcher. So fundamentally, this part of the paper was trying to provide a technological landscape using a variety of sources to try and understand the landscape, but also to underscore the differences in scalability and readiness. So in terms of electricity generation, there's a rollout of obviously large-scale solar, wind, and these are facilitated via power purchase agreements as well as wheeling. There's also battery energy storage. From the literature, these types of technologies are considered to offer immediate emissions reduction. So some of the companies, obviously, as you can see, have already undertaken those projects through a variety of wind and solar farms. This type of technology is considered to be very mature, and as I've mentioned, is rolled out wide scale internationally as well as domestically. Moving to mining operations, there's an integration of technologies like your hydrogen, battery haul trucks, ventilation on demand, cooling, and methane capture. These are at a pilot and demonstration levels, given the fact that they are still at an R&D phase, especially hydrogen-backed technologies. So there's also the issue that when you integrate them, you must also consider other costs, like obviously infrastructure, so charging infrastructure, for example. When we move to refining and smelting, this segment of the value chain, I think, is probably considered as a difficult one, given the difficulties in terms of reducing emissions because of their dependence on electricity, high temperature electricity at that. Nonetheless, there's some technologies that are very underdeveloped but are being introduced, like your innate anode. That's the one that is being introduced, especially in South Africa. Closed furnaces and pelletized feed systems also. And as I've mentioned, in terms of maturity, it's still very early for these type of technologies. R&D is still undertaken. And transport and logistics, again, there are mining companies that are pushing towards a hydrogen economy and want to develop hydrogen freight corridors via the hydrogen haul trucks. And again, this type of technology is at an R&D phase and is being tested by one or two companies who we think have the financial muscle to do so. Essentially, what we wanted to communicate at this part of the work is that the decarbonization is going to be phased, but immediate gains will probably be seen with the electricity decarbonization more than anything. So this part of the paper, we were trying to demonstrate the decarbonization frameworks that are undertaken by the different companies whose literature we consulted, but also those that we managed to speak with. More than anything, most of these mining firms have their targets for 2035 and 2050 against company-specific baselines. And what we found is that these frameworks that obviously underscore competitiveness range from electrification, modular and interconnected systems, as well as gas as a transitional fuel to support cleaner, flexible energy supply. What is important for this part of the work is that established and hegemonic mining companies will obviously have the financial muscle to absorb the financial costs and risks. But unfortunately, junior and emerging companies struggle with having the financial muscle, the financial mechanism to sort of deploy these technologies at a wide scale. So there's a level of unevenness, technology unevenness in the industry. So for this part of the section, we're just trying to understand whether policy and regulatory framework could be considered enabler or as a constraint for some of the organization. Like you can see for the IRP, it shapes long-term electricity tariffs and carbon intensity. The Electricity Regulation Act obviously is about electricity reform, which has seen obviously the private wheeling agreements and piggybacking of Eskom's infrastructure. Your Carbon Tax Act and Climate Change Act are price signaling, as well as obviously carbon budgets that are being introduced for some of the mining companies that are in the space. There's obviously, at a global level, the companies are trying to be cognizant or understanding the effect of CBAM, as well as the arbitrarily imposed tariffs from some parts of the north. So we then undertook CS to try and consult organizations or stakeholders rather that were available. And the CS frameworks essentially demonstrate what we think are probably dynamics or pressure points. And these can be understood as regulatory, financial, market pressure, access to capital, trade risks, operational risks, as well as social and labor. From a regulatory point of view, it's obviously the reporting, disclosure agreements that organizations or entities have to comply to. From a finance and market point of view, is the issue of external financing. As you can see, some financial institutions have moved away from high carbon emitting organization to more green technologies. From a trade and competitiveness risk, it's obviously what I've mentioned in terms of CBAM and compliance with net zero rules from countries in the EU. And operationally, it's the issue of access to the grid via Eskom's infrastructure network. And then from a social and labor, it's the issue of labor primarily, because what we managed to understand is that labor is considered to be secondary in a sense that they're only consulted on the outcomes rather than the pathways of decarbonization. And it's also unclear where you locate the employees insofar as understanding the deployment of these technologies. Will you need more electricians, digital technicians, hydrogen specialists? So that's not necessarily clear. And there's also insufficient investment in reskilling and human capital. Essentially, you look at the budget that are being obviously ring-fenced for these type of technologies. Labor is not necessarily clear on where is the training or the upskilling for some of their workers. And then, just as a summary, we then obviously try to understand the strength and the weaknesses of this decarbonization pathway. Obviously, in terms of strength, South Africa boasts strong mineral endowments and active industry deployment of renewables and efficiency technologies already underway. In terms of weaknesses, there's still obviously the issue of coal-intensive grid that drives Scope 2 emissions and dependence on that particular grid. Some of the technologies are still very immature, and they're also deployed unevenly. Opportunities, there's obviously going to be an emerging global demand for critical minerals. There's also licensing reforms which will enable large-scale self-generation and private grid investment. And in terms of threats, the tariff-induced market, global market, local market that organizations have to exist in, and as well as socially, what is the society that is dependent on a mining, coal mining, for example, what does their future look like? So in conclusion, basically, our key takeaway is that electricity decarbonization is the primary emission lever which will see immediate emissions reduction. Technology deployment is uneven, and the decarbonization pathway also has to be mineral specific as well as phased for it to be as effective as possible. And obviously, there has to be a coherent transition will obviously be prephased on the synergy between policies, your energy policy, industrial strategy, social and labor priorities, because obviously you want to deploy these technologies, but companies or organizations in South Africa must still remain competitiveness when compared to global players. And with that said, would like to thank you very much, colleagues, for indulging us.
Thank you, Nokwanda and Sakile, for your insights. I think it takes us into thinking about some of the solutions that we need to be moving to. But often these solutions, we do need to, as you've done, question, whether they still nascent technologies or that they are and who they're applicable to. So I think that paper gives us some very useful insights on that. We're now going to move to our last presentation, which is from Lesego Moshikaro, who's going to talk about platinum group metals in transition. Lesego is a senior economist at TIPS.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you, Saul, for the introduction. So in today's presentation, I will be looking at PGMs in transition. So for the deep dive report, I look at the changes that are taking place in the PGMs industry from a supply side and also from a demand side perspective. So in terms of the problem statement, especially looking at supply, South Africa holds nearly 90% of global PGM reserves, and it's also the leading global supplier. And for the South African economy, PGMs are strategically important for foreign exchange earnings, for mining revenue sales, as well as for employment. And as of last year, PGMs have been designated the critical raw mineral designation under DMPR. And this is particularly important because it shows the industry's strategic importance in South Africa, but also in the global energy transition. And they're also key pillars that are underpinning this strategy in terms of supporting PGMs and also aiming to unlock some of the challenges that are facing the industry. And in looking at demand, there have been a lot of changes in demand for PGMs, and that has been largely attributed to the rise in battery electric vehicle adoption. And, this has also threatened catalytic converter consumption, which has been historically dominating the PGMs market. And for South Africa specifically, catalytic converters are a key export component, and they're also very important to South Africa's automotive industry competitiveness, as well as to the balance of payment. And in looking at data from NAMSA's trade export manual from last year, we've actually seen a very significant decline in the export of catalytic converters, especially to the US and to the EU market. And to the EU market, that decline really speaks to this transition that we're seeing to electrification. And so it will be really important for us to look at that decline more closely, as this is a very important export component for the country. Now, again, looking at demand, the extent and the timing of the decline does really depend on the timeframes, as well as the adoption rates of alternative vehicle technologies, as well as the strength of the policies that are supporting these alternative technologies. So in terms of providing an overview of South Africa's PGM industry, it is an industry that is export-oriented. The demand for PGM is also highly correlated with GDP growth, but prices are also influenced by industry demand. They're influenced by speculation, as well as being influenced by geopolitical shocks. And that's something that we have seen in recent months and also recent years. So I mentioned that, PGMs are very important to the South African economy and also to the mining sector. And the industry in 2024 contributed over a quarter of the mining sector gross value add. And then when looking at the second graph, which shows gross fixed capital formation, we see that there has been quite a steady decline in gross fixed capital formation in the PGMs industry. And this has indicated sustained underinvestment in the industry, which has become a very huge concern for mining in general, but also particularly for PGMs industry in South Africa. So the challenges of aging infrastructure, rising energy prices, logistic failures, and also rising costs for the mines have actually eroded the competitiveness and also slowed down investment in new exploration in the PGM industry. So I mentioned that, supply is changing. And this change, unfortunately for South Africa, is not a good change. There has been a decline in overall PGM supply. And you can see from the graph that, a lot of the supply is actually attributed to South Africa's decline, as South Africa is the leading supplier of PGMs. And so we have seen a fall in platinum, for example, and also a fall in palladium as a result of geopolitical tensions, where we see Russia being the largest supplier of palladium. And then also what's important is the secondary supply, because the secondary supply is also a very important part of PGM supply, especially when you're looking at overall total PGM supply. And this supply has also been in decline. This is largely from recycling. And it's been declining as a result of low platinum prices and also reduced automotive scrappage rates, which have made recycling economically unviable. On the demand side, which I've also mentioned, demand has been transforming. We saw, or when we're looking at the data, we see that, jewelry has dominated PGM supply, especially platinum, over the years, especially in the 2000s, until emission regulations in Europe and the US mandated PGM-based catalysts, which drove up automotive demand. And this is for platinum, palladium, as well as rhodium. But again, this demand is changing as a result of regulatory changes, technological shifts, as well as economic shocks. And I think that, it becomes important for us to start thinking long-term about the future demand for platinum, because it is unlikely to still be anchored by the automotive industry. So as a result of these, supply challenges that are impacting on the PGMs industry, they also impact on employment. And as I mentioned, that PGMs is a very important employer in South Africa's mining industry. It employs over 40% of South Africa's mining workforce. But, we know that this employment is under threat as a result of these changes. And so the industry recorded 8,500 job losses and a 4.7 employment decrease from the previous year. And so this long-term uncertainty around automotive demand for PGMs, as well as the challenges in the local mining sector, has actually led to widespread restructuring, cost cutting, and also labor rationalization. And so what we're likely to see, especially along South Africa's Platinum Belt, where the Northwest and Limpopo sit, is that, these areas are likely to face long-term vulnerabilities. And because of the job losses that we are seeing and the challenges in the PGMs industry, I think it becomes really important for us to start thinking about PGM workers, especially within a just transition framework. A lot of it has been, dedicated to coal, but I think in doing this work, it calls for us to start thinking about it from, PGMs and also other critical raw materials. So support for displaced workers remains unclear, and with impacts concentrated in South Africa's most disadvantaged and mining-dependent communities, which are already strained by apartheid spatial planning and also by migrant labor legacies. And so even within the PGM industry, I think what I also found was that, the vulnerabilities are uneven. So you also have contract workers, which make up 1/3 of platinum miners, and they also earn approximately 60% of permanent worker wages. And they have less job security and also very limited job security, as well as social protection. But then the responsibility for their transition does often fall on these contractors and not so much on the mining companies. And so it becomes important for PGM workers and mine-independent communities to be considered within a just transition framework, and also using existing instruments such as the SLPs, for example, which do require strengthened enforcement, if the transition is to be just in practice. And this is also what Mohammed spoke to. And from TIPS research, which was conducted by the Just SA team, they recommend that accountability for SLP delivery must be explicitly extended to contractors, where non-compliance attracts penalties proportionate to company revenue. And I think also, given that PGMs have the status of being a green mineral and being important for the green transition, this green demand does not actually guarantee justness or fairness. And so it becomes important that, because we are seeing there's this urgency for critical minerals or CRMs, including PGMs, and there is increased demand, and that there is a risk for accelerating extraction without actually addressing worker community conditions. And there is also a risk of, reproducing old patterns. And so for the just transition, especially looking at PGMs and again, CRMs in general, it becomes important to address the historical and also the ongoing failure of the mining sector to be able to deliver to social and environmental obligations. Because without this structural intervention, and with the declining employment that we're seeing in the PGM industry, there is a likelihood that, this could deepen poverty in both mining towns and also in labor-sending regions. So another implication of the supply challenges that we are seeing for South Africa is the supply risk in the energy transition. And that is because, as a leading supplier of PGM, South Africa is positioned as a critical global supplier in clean energy value chains. But the persistent mining sector challenges do undermine this advantage. And so, especially when looking at byproducts, for example, iridium, which is important for PEM electrolyzers, that supply is dependent on platinum mining. And so, with these downturns that are taking place in the sector, it does put pressure on supply for these byproducts, regardless of price or demand signals that we're seeing. And also, I think it's also important to emphasize that with the current geopolitical climate that we find ourselves in, it really has heightened concerns about supply chain vulnerability and also relying on a single supplier for minerals or for manufactured goods. And so this does increase pressure for finding alternatives, whether it's alternative markets or alternative countries or alternative metals, and also pressure on improving recycling and also reducing PGM loadings. And so for South Africa as a key supplier, if it continues to be perceived as unreliable, then investment in substitution pathways will accelerate. And once mature, we could see a shift in demand that could be structural. And so here, I just want to put emphasis on the CRM strategy by DMPR to say that it's really important to ensure that the strategy is well coordinated and also implementable, so that it signals that there is strategic intent from South Africa to address some of these challenges that are impacting on the PGMs industry. So the last slide looks at PGM demand in mobility. So we know that because of the transition to electrification, PGM demand, there's a lot of uncertainty around PGM demand. And electrification is on the rise. Last year, the IEA reported that almost one in four vehicles that were sold was actually an EV. And also with the current ongoing crisis in the Middle East, we are actually seeing consumers, buying or thinking about purchasing EVs. And there's also been a lot of conversations and discussions around, energy security as a result of the ongoing conflict. And so the EV landscape is evolving, but I think one thing that we're also seeing, especially, something that's emerged in the last year, is the rise in hybrids. So hybrid vehicles have grown stronger than expected, and they've also narrowed the gap between battery electric vehicles as well as hybrids. And so what this means, especially for PGM demand, is that hybrid vehicle growth does provide a medium-term bridge in terms of sustaining PGM demand. But long-term, especially for the automotive industry, there had been a lot of forecasts that, fuel cell vehicles will be able to be an anchor player in terms of sustaining PGM demand. But when looking at the numbers for fuel cell vehicles, we see that demand is slow, and it's also unlikely to reach the scale that is required to actually sustain PGM demand long term. And so that does create an adoption and demand risk. And also for South Africa, we know that, PGMs play an important role for the hydrogen economy, but this has not yet materialized. And so this does place importance to promote diverse uses for PGMs locally, but also globally as well. So to conclude, as PGM mines mature and also mining supply from South Africa decreases, it becomes important for South Africa to prioritize SLP frameworks, for example, for mine workers, targeting PGMs and also related CRMs, especially given the rising demand for these metals. Another thing that's important to consider is that timeframes are important, because what we are seeing with PGM demand is that the decline will be gradual. It's not going to be abrupt, especially also given some of the disruptions that we're seeing in EV adoption across EU and the US market. And then also lastly, another takeaway that I don't have here is that it also becomes important, to start looking for other alternatives for PGM applications and really try to expand that basket instead of just relying on a single market. Thank you.
Thank you, Lesego. Again, some very important insights into a key South African mineral, and some also thinking through some of the technologies that we're going to need to thinking about going forward. Let me then open up to questions. The questions can be for any of the presenters, so not only this last panel, but if there were questions. I think there was one that came through earlier that I'll ask for from Mohammed. It was from Aisha, who says, you mentioned the need for more follow-up. In an ideal world, would these follow-up mechanisms what would these follow-up mechanisms look like to you in the SLP context? Okay, you've got that. Okay. I don't know if there's any questions in the room. There are some hands, so let's start here and then move across. If you can introduce yourself. Thanks.
Thank you and good afternoon, colleagues. My name is Khomoso. I'm from the Northwest Province. I work for the Provincial Treasury. The first question I have is for an earlier presentation around the mechanics. I just wanted to find out which areas was the study focused on, were the specific areas that were identified, or is it a national kind of picture? The second question is in relation to the presentation on the emissions analysis. I just want to find out when you showed a slide there of the different emissions from the various, like your products. I just want to find out, did you look into which products have the most emissions, or was it ranked in terms of, you spoke about coal, you spoke about PGMs. Was it part of your analysis to look at which of the products causing the most, in terms of emissions? And then the last question is in relation to the last presentation that we had. I'm curious to find out, we we've also been obviously trying to look at the possible venturing into fuel cells and fuel cell development. I just want to find out in terms of numbers, in comparison to the guys that are, taking up on the fuel cells vis-a-vis the traditional batteries in terms of the EV space. Thanks.
Thanks. There's another hand over there. If you can introduce yourself.
Thanks. My name is Dombi. I'm an economist at TIPS. My question is for Lesego. You said the IEA reported that 1 in 4 vehicles sold is an electric vehicle. So I wanted to find out if that's a global number, and if it is, what does that number look like for South Africa? Thanks.
Thanks. Richard?
Thanks. The challenges related to labor outsourcing come up in so many different contexts, mentioned in PGM mining, and I'm just wondering if there is any work going on about how to address this phenomena cross-sectorally, because, yes, one would want labor contracting companies to be taking on the kind of responsibilities that are addressed in SLPs, but I'm not sure that isn't wishful thinking. Certainly, when it comes to a subsector by subsector approach. So it seems like something we've had it even within state-owned enterprises outsourcing their labor. So surely one of the overarching things we need under the context of job security, sectoral resilience plans for employment is something to address that rather than piecemeal across sectors. Thanks.
Thanks. We've got one comment online. So it's just a comment from Maseko, who notes the presentation on PGMs and catalytic converters, as well as the technologies that Sakile presented, saying the market can pivot to hydrogen fuel cells technology. And Anglo invests extensively, including in Germany, on research, and there are vast applications from marine to auto. So there are lots of new issues emerging, I think, on that front. I think it's just a comment. Let's then take responses, and then we can see if there are any other questions. If there aren't, we'll then ask each of the presenters to give their final 1-minute closing after we've done the answers to this question, but there may be some others that come. Who are we going to start with? Let's start on this side. I don't know if you guys, Akona, Sakile, if you want to respond to anything, then we can move to Lesego and then the team from the first batch. So Mohammed, Dylan.
To answer the question on product-specific analysis, the report was not about that level of analysis. It was based on company reports and the technologies that they would then deploy. And it was based, I think the most dominant premise of the paper was to try and understand, is the South African environment conducive for the type of technologies that are being deployed by mining companies, and if we are measuring South African mining companies according to global counterparts, what is inhibiting or constraining these mining companies to adopt these technologies at scale, and whether is there whether there are recommendations within the current policy environment that needs to be made for the government to enable the South African market to be able to compete globally. Thank you.
Oh, thanks. So on PGMs, so on fuel cell numbers, I don't have them off the top of my head, but they are in the report, where I show data by Bloomberg as well as by IEA that shows forecasts for fuel cell electric vehicles. And so what we're seeing is that BEV technology is just superior. So fuel cells were initially for, and even now for trucks and heavy duty vehicles. But then even in Europe now, we're seeing that, some trucks are actually going towards the electrified route instead of fuel cell route. And so in mobility, the role of fuel cells is likely to be very limited and also likely to be niche. But before, the numbers were, looking at fuel cells to be this anchor demand sector. But unfortunately, the numbers show that that is not going to happen. And also what we're seeing, especially in terms of fuel cells globally, again in mobility, is that countries in the EU are also backtracking in terms of some of their policies in supporting fuel cell electric vehicles, because they're just not taking off. There are a lot of cost challenges, infrastructure challenges, and when it comes to cost parity between ICE and fuel cell vehicles, it's just too large, and they do need policy support. And without the policy support, it becomes very difficult for fuel cell vehicle demand to increase. And of course, there has been, a lot of R&D put in, from South Africa, especially by as was mentioned, Anglo-American. But there are also other partnerships emerging that are trying to look at just broader applications, especially because given that, when it comes to the hydrogen economy and also when it comes to fuel cell electric vehicles, the demand is just not taking off, and it's, again, unlikely to take off. It's likely to be very limited, which is why it's important to extend that basket. And I think at the Mining Indaba this year, it was announced that it was Valterra, it was Johnson Matthey, and another mining company are actually going to invest a lot of R&D in trying to find alternative approaches. And then, Ntombi, on your question around the IEA numbers, those are global numbers, and the numbers are majority driven by EV demand in China as well as in the EU. And then looking at the South African numbers, so in the South African context, NEVs, which include batteries and hybrids, make up just over 1% of total new vehicle sales, and a lot of that is imported. So when it comes to plug-in hybrids, for example, there has been this really strong, or this sharp increase in the importation of plug-in hybrids in South Africa. But BEVs, it's still quite low given some of the, perceptions and challenges around BEV adoption in South Africa. So full battery electric, still very slow. But then when you look at the whole NEV, including hybrids, then we are seeing rising numbers for electric vehicles. Thanks.
Yeah, so I suppose while I'm up here, I might as well give my closing remarks. So I think one of the key things that we need to think about is that we can't live in a state of perpetual transition. And by that, I mean that if the end goal is decarbonization and we're trying to move towards, full EVs, we're trying to move to a place where we're not emitting, particularly from the transport sector, I do think that we need to stop thinking about the issue of transition fuels in the sense that from a cost perspective, it costs obviously operators, it costs consumers as well. Because if you think about it, consumers are going to have to pay for that investment in sort of the installation of the transition fuels. The cost of that infrastructure is what I'm referring to. And then again, we are going to have to do the transition again to the full EVs. And I think if we keep doing this sort of dual investment in different areas, part of what that does is then in sort of 10, 15 years from now, we then need to think about what are we going to do with that biodiesel infrastructure that we've put in place. And in the process, we would have then a key issue that Saul was raising around food security. We would have then taken from food security into something that might not be necessarily a long-term investment. And so I think part of what we need to think about is, what is it that we're trying to do here? Are we trying to decarbonize, or are we trying to do something else? And so I think those decisions should sort of follow whatever decisions we make about the transition should follow the answer that we're giving to it. And I raise that in sort of the context of food security as well. We've seen it with the soya beans. Again, food security is important. So yeah, let me stop there. Thanks.
I'm going to take a page from Nokwanda's book and also do my closing, if that's okay. So just to the question, a follow-up. So, so what can be done? So, I mean, this is a multi-stakeholder environment, well, particularly as it relates to SLPs and some of the issues identified. So first thing, what can be done is, DMPR needs to enforce and implement the SLP regulations according to the MPRDA and the subsequent amendments, particularly the provisions around consultation and linking SLP initiatives with the needs of local economies. Then beyond that, in the SGRP itself, we make our best effort to leverage existing laws like the Climate Change Act, for example. And the Climate Change Act makes quite a number of provisions in terms of participation across government departments and within government tiers as well. So here, integration of SLPs and acknowledgement of the role of SLPs in just transition planning and policy making may also add further motivation to appropriately use the SLP provisions and ensure that they're implemented properly. So in closing, with that thought, and also to acknowledge Richard's thought as well, I don't really have a response. It's to acknowledge the importance of, maybe this idea of looking at labor outsourcing needs to move beyond just a sectoral examination. Agree with that. No dispute around that. So in short, SLPs are a tool, but we need to understand where they're positioned and what their potential is. Ultimately, they're part of the policy toolbox of just transition tools. And their effectiveness is ultimately dependent on how they're leveraged in a policy toolbox. Thanks.
On the question of the area of the study for our deep dive, it was a national study. Data was taken from Stats SA. But then just to flesh out some of the key findings from the provincial data, we said that 70% of the employment was in Gauteng, KZN, Eastern Cape, and the Western Cape. A third of the employment is in Gauteng, with 14% in KZN, and the Western Cape and the Eastern Cape both have 10%. And that was in 2025 Q2, the most recent. My closing remarks as well. We see that South Africa's highly informal and fragmented auto repair sector means that without targeted support, many mechanics, and especially informal mechanics, risk being left behind. So investing in bulk current and also future mechanics skills will determine whether the sector adapts successfully to a more technology-driven autos industry and not leaving the informal sector, behind. Thanks.
No, it's just to say decarbonization is obviously a climate change imperative, but also fundamentally it must all underscore long-term resilience and competitiveness of mining firms. And for it to be just, obviously, all stakeholders, their interests must be represented sufficiently. That's all. Thank you.
So I think in doing this research around PGMs, one thing that stood out for me was that, South Africa's mining sector is in transition, especially as a result of, this increased demand for green or strategic minerals. And if workers are not supported or prioritized within this transition, and if also South Africa is not proactive in terms of, trying to improve worker conditions and also make sure that workers are protected in the event that they lose their jobs. And we will see worsening conditions for workers, for mining communities, as well as for the environment. So I think it becomes really, really important for us to think about, how we want to maintain this just transition framework for the upcoming CRMs or strategic minerals. And then just on the demand side, for the longest time, PGM demand for South Africa has been, linked or aligned to the downstream beneficiation of catalytic converters. And I mentioned that, that is an industry that is in decline. And so fuel cells have, now been this alternative or been seen as this alternative industry for South Africa. But, I think there are still some question marks around, industries where fuel cells go into. So it also becomes important for South Africa to invest in or continue investing in R&D to look for alternative applications, to ensure that in us mining PGMs, we're still able to beneficiate them downstream across other manufacturing industries. Thanks.
Thanks very much to our speakers. There's a question that Lengiwe posed, which I'll answer. And she's saying, what does it all mean for the just in the just transition imperatives? And I think Lesego's answered some of that, but it's why we're doing the research. We want to understand, what does it mean for workers? What does it mean for communities? And looking at sectoral issues, looking at place-based issues, and the body of work that we've done here. And we're going to have another seminar on the 16th where we start looking at some other issues. We're going to look at ecotourism, some of the weather climate prediction capacity that we have. We're going to be looking at the issues around technology as well. For firms, and then also some of, for smallholder farmers, and also looking at the impact of smallholder farmers and climate change. So we're trying to get a cross-section of knowledge so that as we do the work, we're informing, and this is what TIPS does, we're informing the policy space so that better decisions are made with more granular details, with a better understanding of the impacts that are coming. We can see things that are happening. We understand that there are challenges, and through hopefully research and the dialogue seminars that we're running, we better understand what it means, that it's not just a transition, it's a transition that is just. So with that, I'd like to thank our funders for this particular research project, UK Pact and FCDO, who've contributed resources so we can do this interesting work, to the researchers who've presented very interesting information today. And we do have that seminar on the 16th where we'll present more. And to everyone who's joined us online and in the room, thank you very much. And also to the team who sit in the background, posting questions, making sure the technology works. Thanks to everyone. Thank you and have a good afternoon.